Is this the beginning of the end for Lewis Hamilton at Ferrari? Or are we facing one of the most unfair and misunderstood chapters in recent Formula One history? What happened to Hamilton in Japan and the Chinese Grand Prix has left the paddock completely divided. Disqualifications, technical failures, flawed strategies, and a manipulated media narrative threaten to destroy the seven-time world champion's reputation. Today I'm going to tell you everything that really happened behind the scenes, from unforgivable mechanical errors on Ferrari's part. If you think what you saw on TV was the whole truth, brace yourself because this is just the beginning. Lewis Hamilton's disqualification from the Chinese Grand Prix was not only a direct blow to the British driver's on-track performance, but also exposed a series of structural errors that shook Ferrari's technical credibility. And although many at the time treated it as a simple case of technical non-compliance, the evidence that has emerged since reveals a much more complex picture, even worrying for the Italian team. Because what happened in Shanghai wasn't an isolated incident, it was the visible symptom of a much deeper problem. To understand the origin of this crisis, we must go back to the preseason testing in Bahrain. During those crucial days, Hamilton's SF-25 suffered a series of mechanical issues that prevented the completion of full race simulations. This, in the world of Formula One, is practically a verdict. Because without that data, the team couldn't get an accurate understanding of how the car would perform under prolonged race conditions, with full fuel loads and real-world tire degradation. In other words, Hamilton began the season blind to the performance of his own car. And this lack of information would ultimately cost him dearly. The central problem came after the sprint, where Hamilton shone with a solid victory. Ferrari, confident in that performance, made adjustments to the car's setup for Sunday. Changes that, by all accounts, were a disaster. After crossing the finish line in 6th place, the stewards discovered that the board under the car known as the skid block had worn below the regulatory minimum of 9 millimeters. The penalty was automatic. What no one expected was that this infraction had a much more serious cause than simply a car that was too low. Emerging evidence quickly pointed to a systemic failure in the car's ride height management system. Ferrari didn't just set up the car poorly for Sunday, it lacked the necessary tools to anticipate the problem. Some analysts suggest that the lack of accurate data led the team to use a setup based on assumptions, without taking into account the changing conditions between the sprint and the main race. And this is no small mistake. It's a structural vulnerability that could affect the entire season, especially when dealing with a driver like Hamilton, whose sensitivity to the car's balance is pinpoint. Furthermore, the lack of dry simulations also played a critical role. During preseason, Ferrari failed to assess how the car would perform with low ride height and high fuel loads. This would explain why the wear on the board was so severe. The car constantly touched the ground throughout the race, which not only compromised the car's legality but also directly affected cornering performance, chassis stability, and driver confidence when attacking fast sectors. To make matters worse, the other Ferrari, that of Charles Leclerc, was also disqualified, albeit for a different reason. His car finished below the minimum regulatory weight after changing the front wing. 2 cars were out for 2 different errors in the same weekend. If this had happened at a back-of-the-grid team, it would be a scandal. At Ferrari, it's simply devastating. And if this weren't enough, the post-incident management left much to be desired. Although Ferrari publicly accepted the penalty and did not appeal, an internal investigation began to determine how such a basic error as height adjustment or weight calculation went unnoticed by a team with decades of experience and almost unlimited resources. It wasn't just an engineering error. It was a failure of structure, process, and internal control. And most seriously, it left Hamilton completely exposed at a critical stage of his transition to Ferrari. All of this shows that what happened in China wasn't simply a technical disqualification. It was a turning point that forced Ferrari to review its processes from the ground up and issued a warning to the entire grid. Even giants can fall if they neglect the most fundamental details. And the worst part? It didn't end there. Hamilton suffered the consequences of that mistake directly at the next race in Japan. But we'll see that in the next section. Because what happened in Suzuka was, literally, a direct consequence of the disaster in Shanghai. What happened in Japan with Lewis Hamilton was the direct and predictable consequence of the technical chaos experienced in China. Ferrari, after the double disqualification in Shanghai, reacted with understandable but deeply limiting logic, prioritizing the car's legality over its performance. To avoid another regulatory fiasco, they decided to increase the SF-25's ground clearance. And while this kept them within the FIA's guidelines, it completely doomed the car's competitiveness on a circuit as technical and demanding as Suzuka. The decision to raise the chassis was an emergency measure. The priority was to prevent the skid plate from grazing the asphalt again with the intensity it had in China. But this immediate solution generated devastating side effects. The first and most noticeable was the loss of downforce. By lifting further from the ground, the SF-25 lost efficiency in ground effect, one of the pillars of the current technical regulations. And on a track like Suzuka, where cornering defines the lap, this is practically a given. The SE's section, for example, demands absolute precision in downforce. Without it, the car is not only slower, it is unstable, unpredictable, and, above all, exhausting to drive. Hamilton felt it from the start. He reported chronic understeer in high-speed corners, which forced him to modify his driving style to compensate. But in doing so, he wore the front tires unevenly, especially the right one, on a track that already imposes enormous lateral loads. An estimated 70% of the Suzuka lap is completed under G-forces exceeding 4G. This not only limited his qualifying speed, where he finished 8th, his worst result at this track since 2012, but also jeopardized his race from lap 1. And as if that weren't enough, Ferrari also failed in its strategy. After an early red flag caused by the multiple accident between Ricciardo and Albon, the team opted to fit hard tires on Hamilton's car. The theory was clear. A more durable rubber could allow the Briton to complete the rest of the race without stopping, gaining positions due to wear on his rivals. But reality was unforgiving. With ambient temperatures of just 15 degrees and a car unable to generate sufficient load, the hard tires never reached their optimal operating window. They simply didn't work. Hamilton reported it directly to his engineer. The front right tire was dead mid-race. And in Formula One, when a front wheel stops working, there's no tactic that can save you. A second unplanned stop was necessary, which meant losing all the ground gained on the track and falling into traffic, where the SF-25 also couldn't defend itself effectively. Because here comes another key point. In addition to understeer, Ferrari has been struggling with a structural defect in the rear suspension since the beginning of the season. Specifically, in the inertial damping system known as IBS. This component, vital for controlling the chassis vertical movements, isn't working as it should. The result is a bouncing car, punishing the rear tires during acceleration and compromising traction in slow and medium speed corners. A problem that not only affects race pace, but also the car's consistency lap after lap. And although from the outside it may seem that both drivers share a car and therefore should perform equally, the technical reality is different. Charles Leclerc has found a more stable setup, one that better suits his driving style. Meanwhile, Hamilton, who requires a more reactive front end and more aggressive corner entry, can't fully exploit his talent if the car doesn't respond as expected. Hence the huge gap between the two in qualifying and the race, despite having the same equipment. These kinds of details are what separate a poor race from a real crisis. Because what we saw in Japan wasn't simply a bad result. It was confirmation that Ferrari currently lacks technical or strategic control over its own car. And in the process, it is putting at risk the legacy of one of the greatest drivers in the history of the sport. What happened at Suzuka is more than a 7th place finish. It's a warning sign. A sign that if Ferrari doesn't react quickly, the 2025 season could slip away before even reaching the halfway point of the championship. And for Hamilton, every race like this is one step further from his dream of winning a title in red. Few elements in Formula One have as much power as a simple line of radio broadcast at just the right moment. A phrase taken out of context and broadcast on a global broadcast can completely change the perception of a driver, a team, and even rewrite the history of a Grand Prix. And that was exactly what happened to Lewis Hamilton during the 2025 Chinese Grand Prix. Because what was heard on television wasn't the whole story. It was an edited version designed, apparently, for dramatization. And it ended up unleashing an absolutely unfair media storm. The scene is familiar. Charles Leclerc closing rapidly on Hamilton. Leclerc's car had suffered damage early in the race, but he was still showing a more competitive pace. Ferrari, seeking to maximize points, considered ordering a position swap. FOM, in charge of global television production, aired a single clip of the radio exchange between Hamilton and his engineer, Riccardo Adami. In it, Hamilton is heard saying, "I'll tell you when we're going to swap." That phrase in isolation sounded like an act of rebellion, as if the British driver were openly defying team orders. Social media quickly flooded with comments accusing Hamilton of being selfish, of not being a team player, of being more focused on his pride than the good of Ferrari. The media picked up the narrative, headlines exploded with distorted versions of the event, and the damage was done. But what the public didn't hear because FOM chose not to broadcast it was what preceded that line. Because in reality, Hamilton had already proposed letting Leclerc pass. In a part of the conversation that wasn't aired, he clearly stated, "I think I'm going to let Charles go because I'm struggling." A phrase that showed him aware of the situation, committed to the team, and willing to facilitate the strategy. In other words, the opposite of what was projected to the world. The reaction within Ferrari was immediate. Fred Vasseur, the team principal, publicly lashed out at FOM. He directly accused Formula One's commercial arm of manipulating the narrative to generate artificial tension. "This is a joke," he declared bluntly. And it wasn't just about protecting his driver's image. Vasseur understood the impact such manipulations have on public perception and, more importantly, on internal team morale. Because if the world believes there is conflict within the pit, that perception begins to infiltrate all levels, from the mechanics to the sponsors. But the outrage wasn't limited to Ferrari. Within the paddock, several teams and key figures began to question FOM's role in constructing these dramatized narratives. Because in an era where every word, every gesture, and every millisecond is scrutinized, editing a radio message isn't a simple editorial decision. It's a tool of power. A way to steer public opinion, to generate stories that sell, but don't always represent the truth. Hamilton, for his part, remained composed. He didn't launch into an aggressive public defense, but he did back up Vasseur's statements. He knew that any direct confrontation with FOM could be counterproductive, especially at such a delicate moment in his integration with Ferrari. However, the damage to his image was already done. In a matter of minutes, he went from being the experienced and level-headed leader who won the sprint race to being portrayed as the problematic driver who refuses to cooperate with his teammate. This episode doesn't just affect Hamilton. It also raises a disturbing question at the heart of sports. To what extent is the official narrative being manipulated to entertain rather than inform? And more importantly, how many other stories have been constructed in the same way without the public's knowledge? Because what happened in China wasn't just an editing problem. It was an active distortion of reality. A clear example of how a narrative can be shaped for commercial purposes, even at the expense of the integrity of the protagonists. And if this can happen to someone like Lewis Hamilton, a 7-time world champion, what can younger drivers expect? Where is the truth in a sport where every word can be edited, cut, reinterpreted? This incident should serve as a wake-up call. Not just for FOM, but for all of us who consume and analyze Formula One. Because if we lose context, we also lose the essence of the sport. And in a season where Ferrari is under pressure, where Hamilton is fighting to redeem his legacy, the last thing the team needs is a false narrative dictated from an editing room. After thoroughly analyzing everything that has happened to Lewis Hamilton in this sequence of races, it's clear that we are facing one of the most complex, delicate, and symbolic episodes of his Formula One career. What happened in China wasn't just a technical disqualification. It was the first domino to fall, triggering a chain of errors, desperate adjustments, and, above all, a progressive loss of control within Ferrari. What happened in Japan was a direct reflection of those consequences. A car that no longer responded, a driver limited by his setup, and a poorly executed strategy that left one of the greatest talents in history trapped in the middle of the pack. But what truly underlines the gravity of this situation lies not only in the technical or strategic aspects, but in the silent damage suffered by Hamilton's image. A biased narrative, amplified by FOM and replicated without question by many media outlets, has begun to tarnish what could be one of the most iconic challenges of his career, returning Ferrari to the top. Because when the truth is edited, manipulated, and distorted, it undermines not just a driver but an entire legacy. And in this case, also a team that has historically been under the most intense scrutiny in the sport. Ferrari is today at a crossroads. The internal pressure is immense. The external pressure is even more so. It's no longer just about winning races, but about proving they can operate with the precision and focus demanded by a season in which every mistake, no matter how small, can cost them a championship fight. Hamilton, for his part, has made it clear he's still at the level. He proved it in the sprint in China, he's proven it in every session the car has allowed him to. The problem isn't the driver. The problem is the system that has been built around him. A system that, if not corrected, could end up wasting one of the greatest talents in the modern history of the sport. And this is where you come in. Because as a fan, as a follower of this story, you have the power to see beyond the headlines, to question what they show you, and to seek the full context. Is Ferrari up to this challenge? Does Hamilton have the time, the patience, and the means to reverse this narrative and bring the prancing horse back to glory? Or are we unwittingly witnessing the beginning of an inevitable separation? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I want to know what you think about all this. Is this Ferrari's fault? Is Hamilton being treated unfairly? Or is there something deeper we're missing? And if you enjoyed this analysis, if you value the depth, the truth, and the investigation behind the drama, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, because what's coming next is just as intense. In the next video, we'll uncover the internal chaos at Red Bull, the decisions that have Max Verstappen furious, and what that could mean for the future of the Austrian team. We're approaching a turning point this season. And believe me, we're just seeing the tip of the iceberg.